I want to divide the talk into 3 parts. Originally, I was going to do 5 parts, but then I read earlier this week that there was a professor at New York University who got fired for trying to do too much in his classes. So I will try keep it to 3. So the first part, I want to talk a little bit about the last year, which has been a very eventful year for me. Second, I want to talk a little bit about what kind of research I do in general about causality. And third, I want to make some comments about some of the work I've been doing with some of the tech companies in the last 10 years or so since I moved here to the GSB. And so that part of the talk, I want to reflect a little bit on what I've seen there, what I've learned there, and what I think we need to do at the GSB to ensure that the students here are well prepared to be effective participants in data-driven decision processes at such companies. And so at a high level, that doesn't necessarily mean being able to do all the analysis yourself, but people need to understand these analyses, and they need to be able to ask the right questions, and I'll try to illustrate that. So let me first start by sharing with you some of my experiences from the last year. And this is a particularly nice time to do this, because coming Monday at about 2:15 a.m. Pacific time, the president of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences will again be making a couple of calls to some lucky economists, telling them they've won the Sveriges Riksbank Prize for Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. I'm giving the full name of the prize here because although it's often referred to as a Nobel Prize, it was first awarded in 1969. It wasn't part of the original 5 Nobel Prizes. But it's part of the same organization now, and they use the same criteria. But so one funny story here is that last year in November, the Swedish TV sent a crew over here to make a program about the laureates in economics. And so they spent a day and a half following me around, and then a day and a half following David Cart, and then a day and a half for Josh Angrist. And so out of that day and a half, they managed to condense that to 10 minutes. But a key part did include this exchange at the breakfast table where my 10-year-old daughter was asked me if this wasn't really just the fake Nobel Prize. But back to a year ago, the week had actually been a pretty good week in the Imbens household. My wife had just been elected president of the American Economic Association. That wasn't quite as much of a surprise as it could have been, because it's kind of a Soviet-style election, but there's only one candidate. So the honor was more in getting nominated for that in the first place. But it was a very good thing nevertheless. And in addition, earlier that week, I like to go biking. I'm from the Netherlands originally. I like to go biking, and I'd broken my personal record going up Old La Honda. Many of you probably know where that is, but my previous personal record was from 3 years, from 4 years earlier. So I was actually very pleased breaking it. I think it was 24 minutes 31. So the world record's around 14 minutes. So I'm way behind there, but I was pleased nevertheless. But so it was a good week. Then Monday morning at 2:13, I got my phone rang. Then when I looked, it actually turned out it rang a little earlier at 6 minutes past 2, and I saw that call had come from Sweden, and so that was a very there you go. It was a very indescribable moment. So I picked up the phone, and so the interesting thing is that the call comes from someone named Adam Smith. And so for the chemists and the physicists, that may not really be that unusual, but for the economists, that's really an unusual call to get, because we associate that name more with someone who was a very good economist, but who died a long time ago in 1790. So then the kind of pretty much the first thing they ask is if you're actually willing to accept the prize. And actually, I said, well, before saying that, like, whom am I sharing it with? And it turned out I was sharing it with David Cart, who was a former colleague of mine at Berkeley, and Josh Angrist, who was a colleague of mine at Harvard a long time ago. I was actually a very close personal friend. He was the best man at our wedding, so I was extremely pleased to be sharing with them. Then I said, yes, I was be happy to accept that. Then they said, well, you have about 20 minutes before we announce this at the press conference, and we'd like you to call in so you get a cup of coffee, because it's going to be a big day. And so later I talked to one of the people from the Nobel Foundation. You get a distinct impression that they really like giving these prizes to people in California and kind of waking them up in the middle of the night. And I've seen some more of these videos now where they talk to these people 5 minutes after they've woken them up, and it's sort of clear they're not very coherent. I wasn't very coherent in the press conference, but that's sort of part of the mystique, and it makes for very interesting social media. The year before, there were two other people here from Stanford who won the prize in economics. Bob Wilson here from the GSB, Paul Milgram from the economics department. And they actually live on the same street, and Paul didn't answer his phone. So there's this video where Bob Wilson walks over to Paul's house, which is just half a block. Actually, we used to live on the same street in the early 2000s. So it's a very good street, apparently. But so Bob Wilson walks over to Paul and rings the doorbell, and there's a video automatically recording this where Bob goes, Paul, wake up, you've won the Nobel Prize. And so that video made a big impression on the internet. But so after that, very quickly, actually, the Stanford media team showed up. They were apparently very well prepared, kind of in general, for these things. Showed up with the whole team, helping to handle some of the media inquiries, taking pictures, taking videos, and sending out a series of clever tweets. So here are some of the pictures from very early that morning. Our three kids got very excited about the whole thing and started making breakfast for the Stanford crew. And so here on one of the other pictures, we're looking at some of the emails coming in that my son was then actually managing. So it just made for a very exciting morning. And clearly, Twitter is actually a perfect medium for this type of event. There were just a huge number of them coming in. My favorite one is that Stanford sent out is this one here, which I am happy to use whenever my kids are complaining these days. But Stanford just did an incredible job. One of my former students, Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham, kind of commented at some point that, man, the Stanford media team is really killing it. And this is one place where they clearly beat MIT and Berkeley, where Angrist and Cart are. What are some of the other funny things that happened that day? One was that National Public Radio, kind of following in a long tradition, confused causal and casual, and so they told their listeners that the part of the prize that Josh Angrist and I shared was for our study of casual relationships, and so Susan wasn't particularly another thing is that sort of at Berkeley, where I used to be, there's actually an additional benefit coming from winning the Nobel Prize. You get your own parking spot. Now, I don't actually need that here, because we live on campus, so I actually ride my bike to campus. Then later I find out that in some places, including in the Netherlands, they do actually give reserved, dedicated parking spots to Nobel laureates. But and so I was tempted to go ask the dean if I could get a bike parking spot. But then I found out that the most recent Nobel laureate in the Netherlands, who had one of these spots, then had his bike stolen 2 weeks later. Presumably the thieves figured out that was going to be a valuable bike and or at least a memorable one. So I decided to just stick with parking it anonymously here in front of the GSB. Now, second thing is that sort of since getting the prize, one of the things has changed, that I have to do a lot more general talks. Sort of, where before I was giving a lot of, I would typically give academic talks. Now some of these audiences are much more general, and that obviously creates challenges. And so what I've done kind of is what I do with most of the challenges coming my way as academic. I sort of try to talk to people, try to find people who are experts on this, do some research on this, and some parts of it have at least improved. But one of the most challenging one was I had to give the commencement speech at my son's high school graduation. He was graduating last year. And so that was a particularly tricky audience. So at some level, it was just an audience of one that mattered here. I obviously, the worst outcome would be if my son was unhappy with that. But we have 2 more kids at the school, so I also had to make the other constituencies happy, including the parents, whom we interact with a fair amount, as well as the teachers. So I was very worried about that for a while. So I spent some time thinking what to do there. So what I actually did at the high school commencement was talk for a little bit about how I thought about how I got to the topic for that. And so I started describing how I went to Brown University for that commencement a couple of weeks earlier. I'd gone to graduate school there, and I went back for commencement because they gave me an honorary degree there. And so at Brown, I had a chance to listen to some of the commencement speeches there. And there were some very interesting speeches at that commencement, including Nancy Pelosi, but also actually, sorry, I forgot to, even though I did not get a parking spot, I did get a street named after me in the Netherlands in front of my old high school. So that was again, not quite sure what to do with that, but it was a very interesting experience. But back to so I went to Brown for commencement, and so one of the commencement speakers there was Shaggy. Now, I had not heard of Shaggy at that time, and my kids had not heard of Shaggy, but there's sort of a group in between, including most of the teachers at my son's school who had heard of Shaggy. And so when I brought up his name, they all perked up because they were kind of curious where that was going to go. And so for those of you who don't know who Shaggy is, he's a reggae artist. He had a big hit in 2000 called "It Wasn't Me." And so I started describing this, and now the teachers got very interested to see how I would pull that off, because the song is about this guy who cheated on his girlfriend, and he goes to Shaggy, and his girlfriend caught him, and he goes to Shaggy and said, "Well, what am I going to do?" And Shaggy said, "Well, just deny it." And the rest of the song sort of goes into graphic detail about all the evidence that the girlfriend has. The text, the phone calls, the videos, all the incontrovertible proof. And Shaggy every time says, just say it wasn't me. And so I told the story, and I said, well, I was kind of confused why they thought that was actually a good idea to kind of have that, why Shaggy doing that song was a good idea in this day and age, kind of just not taking any responsibility for what you've done, a completely denial of all truth. So afterwards I talked to Shaggy. He said, well, who told you that was a good idea to kind of send the brown students into the world, kind of with this message of just denying all the truth? And then Shaggy said, well, wasn't me. So that actually worked incredibly well there for the commencement, because the teachers really liked it. And then the students were very confused why the teachers were so happy, but they thought it must be somehow interesting. And so that went very well. So let me now kind of switch to the second part, where I want to talk a little bit about my research. And as Jim said, this will be on the exam at the end. But rather than do my own version, I'm going to give you a video that Stanford recorded again in the early hours of October 11th last year. A colleague of mine used this in one of his classes last year, and then the student said, "Wow, that was actually much clearer than what Imbens said himself." So I'm not going to tempt fate here, and so I'm just going to play the video here.
My name is Carlton Imbens. That's, it's Pop. Again, Pop, can you just...
Susan, can you take my phone, actually?
From what I understand.
Either it's like or you are famous.
Let's say I want to understand.
From what I understand, you take data and you kind of run your own experiments without actually running an experiment. Like you can take data and use it as if it was your experiment.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of, in a lot of cases when we try to get the answer to important questions, we do experiments. When they tried to figure out if the vaccines for COVID were working, they did all sorts of experiments. But in a lot of cases in economics, you can't do experiments. It kind of just doesn't work. We can't say, well, you go to school and we're going to have this whole other set of kids and they're not allowed to go to school.
Yeah, that's not.
So that wouldn't work. And so we need to kind of try to tease out those things from data where people just make their choices and kind of do what they want to do. And so we kind of try to come up with clever ways of still teasing out these effects.
And so you might use behavior things or...
Well, so kind of what I've done is a lot of the methodology, kind of so trying to help people understand exactly how these things work and giving them better methods for doing these things. And so another study that one of my friends who won the prize with me, George Angris, did, was he was interested in the effect of getting more schooling, getting more education on earnings. And he used the fact that compulsory schooling laws changed a little bit. So if you're born on September 30th, you need to go to school earlier than if you're born on October 1st, because it doesn't really make you a different person, but it makes you on average, get a little bit more schooling. And so kind of he used that as an instrument, kind of as a way of teasing apart the correlation and the causality. And he could see from there that the people who stayed in school just a little bit longer found out that they were actually having higher income later.
It's very interesting.
Thank you.
How you can take data from things that were completely not intended for you for anything, and then use it to draw these astounding conclusions.
I'm Andrew Imbens. Spelling of my first name is Andrew. I'm going to assume my last name is
it's the same as mine.
Yeah. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was a very exciting morning.
Yes. Yeah. So I was wondering about some of the applications of what you've been doing, because we've talked about what kinds of what it is, but so what might you?
Well, yeah. So kind of in general, we were interested in what would be for social policy, it's kind of important to know what would happen if you give everybody some guaranteed income. What would that do to society? What would these would people still try look for a job, or would they kind of just be happy to sit at home? Because you can't do an experiment there. You could look at people who play the lottery, because then some of those people are going to win some big amount of money. And it's kind of like having a basic income. In fact, kind of when the lottery we looked at in Massachusetts, if you win $500,000, you would get a check for $500,000. You would get a check for $25,000 every year for 20 years. So that's kind of very much like having a guaranteed income. We kind of looked at what happened to them. Did they stop working? Did they retire early? Or did they keep working? And it turned out most of the people really just kept working. It was kind of very nice for them to win the lottery, but it didn't really change what they did. That helps kind of inform public policy, and it gives you a credible way of looking at what the effect is of having some income, which would be very hard to do otherwise.
All right, so I'm a little interested in making sure that I understand this. So, if I have to explain it, I know my stuff. Let's say I want to understand whether not having homework for math specifically makes people enjoy it more. And so I've got my school.
Yeah, you could well imagine that would be the case.
Right, yeah, exactly. I don't like homework. I do like math. I don't have math homework. Maybe they're correlated. So my school advertises itself for kids who love math, and they don't have math homework. Since we need more data than just that, we'll look at the other schools in my area. Palo Alto High School and Gunn High School both also take from the same batch of students in the Bay Area, and they do have math homework. What you're saying is that I can't just take a bunch of students from Proof School and a bunch of students from Gunn and ask who enjoys math more. We need a better test group. And so what you're saying is that I should go to Gunn and Palo Alto High School, and I should find students who've not only applied to Proof, but gotten into Proof. They're clearly kids who could have gone to Proof School, but didn't, and now have math homework.
Yeah, and so you kind of could also look at kids who kind of didn't go to Proof, but were really interested in math, but it was kind of too long a commute, so they lived far away from the train station, and it would have been a long bike ride or drive to the train station. But otherwise, they would have gone. And obviously, living far away from the train station is probably not really correlated. It has nothing to do with liking math or not.
You wouldn't expect it to, at least.
Yeah. And kind of more generally, there's a lot of cases where you want to compare these two groups, but you're worried about them being different in other ways. You look for these small things that change the incentives a little bit, but that do not have anything to do with who they are or what their preferences are.
Right. So it all sort of boils down to, if you want to know whether thing A has an effect on people, you compare really similar people. Like you want to make them as similar as possible in all the ways except for thing A.
Yeah, and you kind of use these instruments that kind of change this incentives to be in one group rather than the other.
Things that people don't have choice over, so that
yes, exactly.
it's like a randomized study.
Yeah, exactly. And so that for that small group, it becomes like a randomized study. It becomes like an experiment. You get the benefits of an experiment without actually having to run an experiment.
Incredible stuff, clearly.
Thanks. So now, what is an example of one of these natural experiments that Kurt Engers and I got the prize for? And I alluded to that in the video. There was one study I did with when I was at Harvard with a colleague of mine there, Don Rubin, and a student, Bruce Sasserdote, where we were interested in the effect of unearned income. What would be the effect of having a basic income kind of on a variety of outcomes? Initially, actually, we were interested in the effect on children, but there were not enough people in the sample in the end to do much with that. So we looked at the effect, how it affected people's labor supply, how much they work. And so clearly, you can't directly... it's clear that it's a question that's important for deciding on social policy, but it's difficult to get at that directly. And so what economists had done in the past was do things like look at the effect of spousal income on individuals' labor supply. But it doesn't really work very well. If you were to compare, say, men whose wives make $100,000 with men whose wives make 50,000, you don't see that the men with the high-earning spouses work less than the men with low-earning spouses, because they're very different. There's a lot of sort of matching these days in marriage, and there's actually a lot of research on that. Raj Chetty at Harvard is kind of looking at a lot of these things where the correlation in characteristics between spouses has gotten much higher over the years, and so that doesn't really work very well. People have also looked at the effect of inheritances, but again, that's not even remotely random. It's something people often anticipate, and there may be other transfers prior to that. So what we did here in this study was look at people who won the lottery. And this particular lottery, it meant you would get paid over 20 years, so you would actually get regular payments for a long time, completely unrelated to your own income, to your own decisions. Now, then it turned out there were still kind of some challenges. The people were fairly different to begin with. The people who won large amounts of money because of the non-response type issues. But in the end, that allowed us to get very precise and very credible estimates of how much people would work less per dollar they would actually receive. And it's on the order of 5 to 10 cents less per dollar. In some sense, they consume leisure. They use some of that to reduce their hours and have more free time. But so this is a way where earlier work had a very hard time coming up with credible ways of identifying that. Doing an experiment clearly was not something feasible. That would be incredibly expensive and take an incredibly long time. But data out there would allow us to cleverly get a handle on these issues. Now, let me stay here for a second. Now, for the last part, I want to talk a little bit about the work I do at some of the tech companies. And so I started doing that when I moved here to the GSB, and it's been a great learning experience. It's been very inspiring for my research, and I've learned a great deal. But so one time I was in a meeting where a decision was going to be made about either implementing some change in an algorithm or not. And it could be, you could imagine sort of at Airbnb, you decide to make the way you show you change the way that you show the properties. You put videos up there instead of just pictures, or you put more detailed descriptions out there. And so they wanted to know what the effect was going to be on rentals for doing that, and so they ran a randomized experiment. And now suppose, and I'm making up these numbers, suppose that the estimate was about $3 per unit per year or something. That's not particularly big, but you multiply it with a lot of customers, that was a big number. But the standard error was $2. And so what does that mean? Well, it means we're not really so sure about the $3. In fact, if there was nothing there, if this change made no difference whatsoever, then you could easily get an estimate as big as 3 if the standard error is 2. And so the technical way of saying that is that the p-value is the probability of getting an estimate that big if the effect there's nothing there is about 0.13. And so that's fairly big. In fact, it's so big that the technical term is that we say it's not statistically significant. But so the question is, what do we actually do with that? And there's a tendency in the academic literature and kind of also outside of that to kind of take that very seriously. Kind of often in tables, we make clear which estimates are significant. Kind of we put stars on them. So this is where I was reminded of the story by Dr. Seuss. Those stars weren't so big. They were really so small. You might think such a thing wouldn't matter at all. But because they had stars, the star-belly sneetches would brag. We are the best kind of sneetches on the beaches. And so these things make a big difference. They make a difference in academics, where often there's a tendency not to publish papers that don't have significant results. But even outside academics, it makes a big difference. For drug companies, when they do their trials, if things are not significant, that can have a huge impact on their valuation. And in fact, there was a court case. So in academics, what you see is that people try to change the specification, do some additional analysis, find some way of getting to the stars. And you can see that by looking at here's a table of kind of the distribution of all these p-values. And you see that people clearly try to find some way of getting to the promised land where they can put stars on these tables. In fact, now many journals now actually use the star-off machine from Sylvester McMonkey McBean, and we don't allow people to actually put stars in these tables to emphasize the fact that these p-values are not quite that important. And there's sort of a lot of discussion in the academic world on that. But it's also outside of academics, where there was a court case where a pharmaceutical executive was in the end convicted by manipulating p-values. So what he did was not actually calculate them incorrectly, but he took a sample where this drug didn't seem to have much evidence of any efficacy. The p-value was too big. And he then said, well, let's look at a slightly different sample where we throw out people who were really sick because maybe the drug doesn't do anything for them. And maybe you throw out some of the people who are doing very well, and so the drugs doesn't do anything for them. And then for this middle group, carefully chosen, there was an effect with a p-value of 0.004. And he got into big trouble for that. So back to the question in this discussion. So we have this point estimate of 2, standard error, of 3, a standard error of 2. It's not significant. Does it actually matter? At some level, it doesn't. And the person in the room who was actually in charge of making the decision said, well, okay, we have an estimate of 3, so that's good. So it actually seems more likely that this is actually doing something in the right direction. So why do we really care about the standard error? Do we care about the standard error? And so that was a very astute comment. So why do we actually care at that point? And in what way should the standard error really affect the decision we're going to make? And so one way of thinking about it is that, first of all, clearly we do care about the standard errors. If we didn't care at all, we could just do really tiny experiments. We could just take 2 people, randomize them, and so let one of them see the videos and the other one see the pictures, and then make a decision based on that. And clearly that would not be a sensible thing to do. But why do we care about the uncertainty there? Now, one thing you could argue is that maybe we are risk averse. If we get this point estimate of 3, but maybe it could just as well be 7 as -1. And maybe 7 would be great, and this would become the biggest company in the world. But -1, they would be bankrupt. And so maybe they really don't want to take that risk. And so if there's a lot of uncertainty, they wouldn't make these decisions to go ahead, even if on balance it looks like it would be good. But that's in many cases, that's actually not really the real reason. In many cases, these decisions are actually not that big, and so you're not really risking the whole company by making that decision. So what's really the reason for being concerned about the uncertainty? Well, at some level, it's because I think, in many cases, these ideas we're trying out are bad ideas. Most of them are probably bad ideas. And the whole reason we're doing experimentation is to figure out what are the good ideas and what are the bad ideas. But most of the ideas, especially kind of in these more mature companies, they've got to be bad ideas because they're already reasonably close to doing well and being effective. And so you can actually look at that. So here's a table from a paper by a statistician here at Stanford, Brad Efron. So this is not actually from the tech companies here. This is just medical experiments. He looks at a huge number of medical experiments and looks at the ratio of the point estimate and the standard error, the z-statistic. And you see that most of them are close to zero. Now, kind of all these estimates have some uncertainty in them, and so he can actually decompose that and get an estimate of the distribution of what is essentially the value of all these ideas. You can think of it as so each time every idea has some true intrinsic value, and then we do an experiment to figure out, to estimate that value. And what you see for that distribution of these true values, and this is kind of for medical experiments, for drug trials, where the costs are very high. So they try to really make sure that these ideas are good before they do the experiments. And still, most of these ideas are bad in the end. And probably in the sort of the experimentation in the tech companies, it's even worse. That kind of most of these ideas are bad. But that's not bad in itself, because the experimentation helps us figure out which ones are the good ones. But in order to do that, you can't just take the point estimate. You need to combine that with what you think is actually the distribution of the true value of these ideas. And so you can think of it as every idea sort of comes from this distribution, and now you learn how good that particular idea is, but you don't just want to take the experiment, you want to combine it with what you thought beforehand. And so it takes a fair amount of evidence before you should be convinced that a positive estimate is actually really indicative of a true positive effect. You should shade it back, shrink it back towards what you thought before you did the experiment. And if you think beforehand, and all the evidence is there, if you think beforehand that most of the ideas are actually bad, it is good to take a lot of evidence, a lot of precision in the experiment before you're convinced that something is actually a useful thing to implement, before you should make the decision to go ahead. And so the reason we care about the uncertainty is not intrinsically that we care about p-values, but what we care about is how it changes what we thought before we did the experiment. And before the experiment, we were fairly skeptical that any of these ideas were very good. And now it takes a fair amount of evidence to convince us, or it should take a fair amount of evidence to convince you that this new idea is actually a good one. And so if the standard error is very small, that evidence is there. If the standard error is very big, that evidence is not there, and you shouldn't be convinced by that new idea. And so formally, the way to think about it is from a Bayesian perspective. We're making decisions. We're not trying to test hypotheses about what the truth is, which is where originally these p-values were designed for, and where they're still very useful. It's still the case that sort of in high-energy physics, they use p-values to decide whether they found a new particle or not, and they're very careful. They don't want to. They're looking for a relatively absolute version of the truth there, but that's not the way the experimentation is used in many other settings, where we're kind of pretty sure the things do something. We're just not sure how much they're doing, and we want to update our beliefs to make sure that we're making effective decisions. And so in order kind of for the students here to be well prepared to kind of participate in those decisions and understand how you actually use data and what you're trying to get out of that, we kind of need to make sure they have a fair amount of sophistication. And again, it's not about the technical part in actually doing these analysis, but it's in understanding what the statistics can actually deliver, what we're trying to get out of these experiments, how we design these experiments, and what type of problems come up in these experiments, so that people can ask the right questions and not get bamboozled by the analysts. Kind of we're looking at this data, and we might just say, well, but it's not significant, so you shouldn't do these things. You need to learn how to ask the right questions, and that's what we're trying to teach them here. So let me stop here and open it up for questions.
In tech companies where they're trying to decide whether, to change a marketing approach or to change something that the feature that the customers will or will not like, can you talk a little bit about how you set up appropriate experiments like that?
Yeah, so that's an incredibly interesting question. It's an incredibly interesting area these days, because for a long time, all the experimentation was really based on the work that had been done in statistics in the 1920s, 1930s, people like Fisher and Neyman. That was kind of the basis of how drug trials were done, and that was initially the basis how experimentation was done in the tech companies as well. But in many cases, the settings are actually very different. One big thing is that where in drug trials, it's very often very reasonable to assume that there's no interaction, no interference between the different individuals. That doesn't work in many of the social science settings or in the tech company settings. So in a drug trial, if I take an aspirin, that doesn't affect whether you have a headache or not, unless I talk too much. But if you're in a different room, you're fine. It does matter for infectious diseases and for vaccines and stuff, but in many cases, we sort of can separate things, and we can look at units that don't interact with each other. In say Airbnb or in the rideshare companies, interactions are intrinsic to the whole to the company. If I try to get a ride from Uber or Lyft, that takes a particular driver off the market for a while, and so that affects all the other potential riders. And so if we do an experiment and we make it more attractive for a bunch of individuals to go get rides, that immediately affects all the other riders, all the other customers in the market as well. And that's true kind of at Airbnb, that's true for all these companies that are based on individuals interacting in a marketplace. But these interactions are very structured. And so that leads to a whole different way of doing experimentation. And so there's kind of a lot of work. There's a lot of work here. There's a bunch of people here at the GSB kind of working with these companies and working on academic research, trying to come up with more effective ways of doing the experimentation there that just looks very different from what people used to do in medical settings.
It's sort of similar to the old adage about military plans, where they say military plans are worth nothing when the shooting starts, but the planning is everything. So it sounds to me like a lot of this is a kind of a structure of how you could go about thinking about all this data in a plan about trying to figure out, get a better idea of where you ought to be going. Am I misunderstanding, or is that kind of close?
Well, so some of it, yes, because some of it we're trying to figure out how we can learn about the things we're interested in settings where we can't do experimentation. Some of it is figuring out what type of data we really need and understanding that it may, in some cases, be very particular data that just tell us about the things we're interested in. Again, in the video, one of my kids referred, in one of the discussions with my kids, I referred to this paper by Angrist and Kruger. We're interested in the effect of education on earnings. And so kind of just comparing people who go to college with people who don't go to college is fraught with difficulties. These people are different in many ways, and so it's hard to get causal effects out of that. What Angrist and Kruger did was figure out some small wrinkle that changed how people made that decision, namely compulsory schooling laws. and in other work, Cart looked at distance to college. Again, that kind of just gives you a small wrinkle where it may affect how people make decisions. So it's kind of somewhat of a combination of being opportunistic and trying to look for as well as trying to look for the right data. But then in other places, the planning is a much bigger thing for the experimentation, thinking through how these interactions take place, what the structure is on these interactions, whether people interact purely anonymously through prices or through other mechanisms can help you design these experiments effectively. Yes?
A question. I have read in the press about a study that was published in Nature in one of its subsidiary journals. It was either Something in Evolution or Evolution and Something, and I don't remember which. But a group in New England decided that there were 61 genes that determined the probability of your living to 100. Have you seen that? And does it follow your rules?
No, I have not seen that. And so, I mean, in that type of setting, it's again very hard to figure out how to separate correlation from causality. Now, there's some things you can do. You can sometimes you can exploit the fact that some of the allocation of DNA is random between kids and parents, and so there's been some work trying to separate out some of the genetic effects from some of the environmental effects. But so I'm not familiar with that particular study. But I think it is all a little shaky with some of these things. I mean, there's also a paper that suggests that, and this is based on data from a while ago, because they at some point released the information about who else was nominated for Nobel Prizes, and they did this analysis suggesting that people live 2 years longer, and that seemed a little shaky. Yes.
On one hand, you want to answer these important questions, and you have limitations on data or natural experiments that you can actually use, as you were saying, to find these little wrinkles that can help you answer those questions. Now, once you find those wrinkles, let's say in the lottery study in Massachusetts, where it's a particular lottery where people, if I understood correctly, don't have the choice whether to get the yearly installments or getting like a full payment, then given that you start having all these constraints, how do you deal with the limitations on whether your results can be applied to other settings? And then how much of the question are we answering, or is it just a result for a very limited setting?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And so in that particular case, clearly we're not really that interested in that particular population itself. Kind of this was people who played the lottery in Massachusetts, and we're interested not just in people who played the lottery, but in the general population. We're not interested in per se in people in Massachusetts. We're interested in the general U.S. population, and so that clearly comes with some limitations. Now, but there's some things we can do. We can see how different these people are who played the lottery from the general population, because we knew for these people we had their Social Security earnings records, so we can actually match them to the rest of the population, see if they're very different. Are they different in terms of the relation between education and earnings? Does it look like these are really very different people in the way they respond? And so in that particular case, there was not much evidence that these people were very different, not even in terms of earnings, where I would have thought there would be more stronger correlations there. But in general, that is a big issue, and so we do worry about the external validity of these studies. At the same time, there is, in this literature, and I think rightly so, a sense that we want to focus first of all on the internal validity. We want to make sure we get credible estimates, at least for some well-defined subpopulation. And then second, we'll worry about how much we can generalize that. And sometimes we go too far in that. There's still, there were experiments done in the 60s for Head Start type programs for early childhood interventions. And because these were done in very small communities, some in Michigan, and a long time ago, and these programs were quite different from what Head Start looks like now. But because they were very small, there were 100 or so kids. So the evidence from that is clearly very limited in terms of its relevance for decisions that are being made today. And still, people keep bringing up the results from those programs because that's one of the few times when we did actually randomize. And we know that at least there, it mattered to have these early childhood intervention programs.
Boy, these reunions are amazing. This is just magical. Holy mackerel. Decision-making culture and the tools that we use. I was wondering if you could share any kinds of engagements you've had regarding the climate problem we have, and just how these approaches are being used to find a way to navigate out of this life-threatening issue, climate change and things like that. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't really have any direct insights on that. One of these things that is actually the most challenging after winning the Nobel Prize is that you get asked a lot of things that are outside my direct area of expertise. And so it's clearly a huge problem. And so a lot of the methods I work on I used in some of these settings. It's trying to figure out what is the causal effect of changing things here on how what agriculture is going to look like, what human development is going to look like. And we can't do experiments in these cases, so we're going to need to use observational methods to shed light on these questions. But I haven't done any direct research on that, so I'm hesitant to go much beyond that.